And welcome back, guys, to the final part of my most important Rook endgame series with the 3 versus 3 plus an extra pawn. And today we are looking at the extra A pawn. And I already gathered a lot of material throughout the last few weeks. Since it's the final part, I wanted to make it extra special, and also because I was honestly not like 100% happy with the way I explained the B pawn in the last video. I hope it was still sort of useful, but I was not 100% happy with my way of presenting because it didn't feel like I made like a clear guide on how to defend those endgames. There were a lot of different scenarios where you had to push this and you had to put the king there. But I think it was one of the reasons for that is because the B pawn is actually probably one of the best versions for white. I spoke to my friend Grandmaster Rainer Buhmann yesterday, and we were talking about those rook endgames a bit. And he had a great explanation for that, which is that if you have the B pawn, then it's kind of like it's more close to the white king, but it's not close enough for the black king to actually get there. While if we look at the D pawn, for example, which we had at the beginning, it was always the case that black's king was still quite close and can help with the defense there. The same also applies with the C pawn. But with the B and also with the A pawn, the black king can almost never actually run to the queen side and can just rely on counterplay, or should rely on counterplay on the king side. With the A pawn, that should be a bit easier to do because the way for white's king typically is also much, I mean, not much, but it's a bit further away than if we look at it from the B pawn. So I'm not sure if I said that in the last video, but I think that the B pawn generally gives white probably the best winning chances if it comes down to a race. Now, what I said earlier already, that I gathered a lot of material, and then at the very end, I actually decided to show some material from this book, which I have right here. I hope you guys can see it. It's Theoretical Rook Endgames by Sam Shankland. And the way he presented it, in general, the book is really fantastic. I already went through a majority of his material, and I can really highly recommend it to all of you if you want to level up your Rook endgames to get that book. This is not a paid corporation or something. I'm not getting anything out of this. I just really want to show my appreciation for the work of Sam here. I think he also told in the beginning of the book that he worked on this for like 3 or 4 years, and I can definitely tell that. And yeah, if you guys want to improve your Rook endgames, definitely check that one out. And I'm also about to show you some of the material which is presented in that book. I hope I'm not getting into trouble for that. But yeah, thank you, Sam, for this book. I really love it. And in case you're watching this, it's really a great work. And what is the best part about it is that it's just the whole structure is so understandable. Like all of the chapters are perfectly structured, and you can easily navigate all of the differences. And that's also why I wanted to show some of his examples, because they were so instructive that yeah, none of my examples which I had earlier were as instructive as the ones which he presented. All right, enough talking. Let's have a look at some Rook endgames. So the position which we see in front of us now is just kind of a start, which is one exception where white is just basically winning quite easily, which was also from Sam's book. And here with the rook on the 7th rank, with black's pawns being on f6 and g6 already, the king is cut off on the 8th rank. And now the problem for black is that he can never go after the pawns on the king side. As I said in the beginning, with this extra A pawn, white's winning plan is basically always to run with the king to the queen side, and black's main defense is going to rely on seeking counterplay on the king side. So grabbing this f2 pawn with the rook in most cases, and then activating the king, and it all comes down to a race in the end. But if black is in time to activate the king, rule number 1, black should always activate the king to either e5 or f5. Then in most cases it's going to be quite easy for black to hold it, if we follow some of the principles which were presented by Sam. Still, many strong players actually did lose this endgame. There are still some ways to go wrong. All right, so here white wins fairly simply just by bringing over the king. King f1, rook a2, king e1. Black can just sit and wait, and the problem is that now whenever black captures on f2, rook b7 is coming, followed by a7. Black can take another pawn here, but a7 will come, rook a2, and then rook b8 check, followed by queening on the next move, and white is simply winning. Even this extra pawn here is quite useful, so that black does not have any ways to set up this 3 pawns versus rook, which anyway now should not work. I can make a separate video about that. There are some cases where 3 pawns against rook can be a draw. If you guys want to see that, let me know in the comment section down below. Anyway, here white is fairly simply winning. All right, so let's head on to the next example. This is what Sam calls drawing setup 1, which is probably the simplest for black if we can get it. What I loved, what Sam Shanklin was pointing out, that in general, once white, for example, here attacks the f7 pawn with rook a7, he always said that keeping the king in the center with king e5 is his preferred way of defending. It's probably doesn't make a huge difference. We can also put the king to e6, but I like his general way of pointing out how important king activity is in this endgame. And black's king should always stay in the center in this endgame with the extra a pawn. I think it was also quite the same with the b pawn. I mean, generally in rook endgames, king activity is quite important, but especially with the a and with the b pawn, I think it's quite an important thing to keep in mind. We've already discovered in some of the previous parts that this is already quite a good defensive setup for black, with the rook now being on the 3rd rank, so that white's king cannot easily get activated like this. So if rook a7, king e5, and once king f1 comes, always go rook a2, not allowing white's king to activate itself by going to e2. And taking on f7 is never dangerous, because after rook takes a6, we get a 3 versus 2 rook endgame, which is in this case it's a simple draw. Even though black's king is cut off here, it should not really make a big influence, because for white to make any progress, he probably needs to exchange some pawns, which will then make the defense also easier for black. One thing though, which we need to be careful about, we'll see another example of that later on, is if white goes for a7 here. Now, I mean, we don't need to play king f6 back immediately, but it's the way we should defend that now, because going for this type of position is what we should avoid. We'll see another example on that later on. This is a lost position for black with the pawn on the 7th rank. But now we can tuck away the king on g7, and the thing is that now white can of course approach with the king, but we can just sit and wait. And if once white goes to the b6 square, then we start giving checks. Otherwise, white is threatening not to take on a7, but rook to b2 check. And then we can just continue checking, and if the king goes back, then we go back to a2. Because once the king reaches the b6 square, then he's threatening to move the rook. For example, now waiting like this would lose, because now white can queen the a pawn. So we just go back with the king to g7, and then white has no realistic winning chances anymore, because bringing the king will not give him any winning chances, because we can always just start checking. So king f1, and now again rook a2. We've seen that in some of the other endgame videos already, cutting off the king on the 2nd rank. On the 1st rank, actually cutting the king off. King to g2, and now the simplest would be to go rook a3. Even to point out in what Shanklin pointed out in the book as well, like you can even be quite clumsy here, and it's still gonna be a draw. Like rook a1 is an imprecise move, allowing king f3. Still, in this position again, rook a1 would be another clumsy move, but just to make a point, it's still a draw here. Rook a4 would be the move which would make the most sense, once again cutting off the king and not allowing it to activate itself. But even this is a draw, rook a1, now king d4, and once this comes, then black always should activate the king with king g4. Now this would be, again, a fairly simple draw, activating the king. Still, just to make a point, even after rook a3, another basically pointless move, it's still a draw. After king c5, however, now it's time for black to seek counterplay with king g4. But just as an example here, black is still in time to make a draw here. We'll see this exact position, I think, later on in another one of the examples. This here is a draw, I think with 2 tempos to spare, if I remember correctly, because white's king is quite far away on b6. If the king is on b3, however, then it's going to be a draw. Then it's going to be winning, apologies. We'll see that later on. All right, so first position was fairly simple. Still, I think we can get this in some of our games. This is quite a practical endgame. We can definitely get that. And keep in mind to keep the king passive, not to let it get activity. And if we get a position where white's king is already fairly activated, we should always keep this idea with king g4, king f3 in mind. All right, so let's go to the next position. Here we have the pawn on f6 and this pawn on g7. Typically, I think we get this formation quite often with f7, g6, h5, but you never know. You can also get this type of pawn structure in this endgame. Now, if white goes for a7, again, we should not push this pawn to g6. This will lead to the losing position, which we'll see, I think, in the next example. But we can again just go back with the king, and once white's king approaches, we can again go back checking with the rook, and there's no way for white to make progress, and it's a draw. So what white can try, and probably should try, is to activate the king with king d4. Otherwise, if it would be our move, again, I would definitely be looking at this move rook a4 from the black side, just to completely cut off white's active play with king d4. Still, here with king d4, again, king g4 is the way to hold this endgame. King c5, king f3, and black is in time for counterplay, picking up all of the pawns, and is going to be able to secure a draw here. So I actually forgot to show this example in the beginning, so I just got back to it now, because we were already talking about it a bit earlier. So this is the exact position which we need to avoid with black. That's quite important to point out. If our pawns are on f6 and g6, and white's pawn is already on a7, this position is lost. Because now the king cannot reach this desired g7 square, which typically we would like to go to. And now white can just slowly bring the king. Black's king cannot leave the f5 square, because then rook to e8 would come, followed by queening. And white can just bring the king. Black also can never go g5, because after taking, however black takes back, there's going to follow a check, followed by queening, and white is winning. And now white can just bring the king, and white has all the time in the world. And actually the best winning plan, or the cleanest, maybe even the only one, is to bring the king all the way to h6. Black cannot do anything, and then to go for rook to b8, with the idea to give a check on b5 next, and after king e6, taking on g6, and then the pawn on h5 will fall. Also rook f5 will come, maybe picking up this pawn as well. Like for example, if rook a3, then can also give a check and then pick up f6 next, and white is easily winning. Yeah, that was just important to point out. Now let's pick up where we have just stopped, which was this endgame here. Now we already know that which we've seen in the first example, we should not go back to the 8th rank, because then again white can bring the king, and black can never again take the pawn on f2 anymore, because then rook b7 will come, followed by a7, and the pawn will just queen. So the king has to go to e6. But now, since we've already seen the previous example, we know that we need to be quite careful now not to go into this position. With king f5 here, for example, would be a losing move, because now rook a8 comes, and black is not in time to bring back the king to g7. If king e6 now, a7, king f7 again loses now because of rook h8. So now black is not in time to bring the king to g7, and now we see this quite typical trick. White is winning because the rook on a7 will fall. Also, king g4 here is not enough anymore. King g2 can come, and then a7, and at some point white will get f3 and is going to be winning. This was, for example, one way to win, and then f3. If king g4, rook g8 was winning, that was kind of an exception here, since f3 is not possible. But then we pick up g6, and then we pick up h5 in the next move as well. So that's winning. So here black has to be quite precise. Also g5 immediately is losing because of g4. g5 now is the breakthrough which we need to go for in general, but immediately it's too slow, because now g5, g4 comes, and the king is still on f1. That's quite an important detail right here. If g takes h4, g takes h5, h3, and now the key move king g1. Since the king is still on f1, white is in time to to stop the h pawn and then basically promote either of the pawns, either the h pawn or the a pawn. So what black needs to do is to wait for white's king to go to the e1 square. Rook a2, king e1 now, and only then to push g5. Another important detail here is that after rook a8, white is actually threatening to go a7. So once rook a8 comes, we should always go king f7. And now after a7 again, rook h8 is a threat. So now black needs to go king g7, but now white still is in the situation that once he brings the king, we will start checking, and therefore it's a draw. So king e1, and now important g5. And now the difference is that if white goes for g4 here, the king is on e1, and after g takes h4, white even needs to be careful already, because after g takes h5, h3, it's black who is the one winning, with the whole point that rook a1 now stops white from getting to the g1 square, and therefore black is even winning because the pawn is queening on the next move. White can still try to take on g5, f takes g5, and now we need to be careful not to go into some position where white can push f4. For example, if black just waits passively here, like this, then white will win with f4. This is generally white's winning idea, and some of you might already know this endgame, that with the f pawn and the pawn already being on a7, now white is a fairly simple winning plan, which is just to push the pawn to f6. Now if king f7 comes, then rook a8, rook h8 again wins with this idea. And otherwise, if the king takes, then rook f8 check is winning, and if king h7, then f7. So we need to be careful about this endgame. But here g4 does the job, and yeah, now once white goes for this, we just need to bring the king to g7, and then white has no way to mobilize the pawns on the king side. White can try rook a8 here. Again, we need to go back with the king, otherwise a7 is going to be a threat. a7, now king g7, we're in time. And now another important detail why the king should be on e1 here. White's only winning plan is now to push f4, otherwise we are in time to play g4, after which is a simple draw. And after f4, now we're in time to push h4. And now with the king on e1, in some variations, he's just too slow to reach the king side. If white takes on h4, it's important now we take on f4. And now with the h-pawn, this endgame is a draw, because even if white gets the pawn to h6, there's still no way for him to make any progress. Even without this pawn, it would be a draw, even without the f4 pawn. Yeah, g takes h4 now would be lost, because now white has the f-pawn. This is an important thing here. Yeah, white can try f5, for example, h3, f6 check, king takes f6, and now there is quite a nice draw here. White can queen, but in the end there's h2, and there's no way for white to reach the pawn. It's still a draw though, because white has the perpetual check here, and yeah, then it's a draw. If king h5, now I was just wondering, I guess that g4 is a problem. King takes g4, and then this should be losing for black. It will lead to Zugzwang in a second. Yeah, so that was the next example. Here it already gets a bit trickier. So generally, if we can get it, I would prefer to have one of those pawns still in the 7th rank. It makes it a bit easier, because then we never need to worry about we never need to worry about this idea that this will be lost with white playing f3 next. Okay, now finally for the last example, of course this was another one by Sam Shanklin. Again, I cannot mention it enough. Guys, buy this book. It's really a great work. This was a game between Etienne Bacrot and Ray Robson, just to get kind of a practical glimpse onto it. It was from the World Cup in Khanty-Mansiysk 2011. And again, a very practical situation. We can definitely get that in some of our games. And here it makes it a bit trickier for black, because the pawn is already still on a3. If the pawn is already on a5, for example, then black would have the idea to sometimes cut off the rook with a4 in some cases. Anyway, white now starts pushing the pawn, because still if he runs with the king now, still the f2 pawn would be hanging. So probably what I just said anyway doesn't really make a lot of sense, because white anyway needs to start pushing the a pawn quite quickly. Now another thing which was pointed out by Sam in the book, well, generally if we get this with white, with the attacking side, we in most cases need to be aware that it's going to be a draw. But he still mentioned what is the best winning plan for white. The best plan to ask black some practical questions, which is to have the rook on the 7th rank, the pawn on the 6th rank and then try to bring the king to the center. Because if we still have the rook on the 7th rank, it's going to be more difficult in many cases for black to activate the king. Like king f5, king g4 will never work with the rook on a7 because we can always just take on f7. I thought that was quite a good thing to remember. I think this was probably a tiebreak game. So I assume that both players were in time trouble. Otherwise, I think that a player of Ray Robson's caliber would definitely find more precise moves. And Ray here started with the move king f6, which was criticized by Sam, which I also agree with, because I mean king f6, there's still nothing wrong with the move from an objective standpoint, but I really liked Sam's move again here, king e5, just keeping the king in the center. And once a4, now rook a3 check, the king cannot activate itself via d4. King e2, rook a2 check, and then we get basically the same which we've already seen earlier. Now king e6, and once king f1 comes, then again rook a2, securing a simple draw. So king f6, now a4, king e6, a5, king f6, black continues waiting like this, a6, and now black already needs to be careful. And he went for king e6 now, which already gives white a winning advantage. So we really need to remember this specific position if we're trying to win this from white. This is already bad news for black. But knowing the winning plan is also going to be quite important because it's not so simple, and it would be quite a pity if we get this in our games and then not remember or not find the right winning idea from the white side. Black still had a draw here with rook a4, king d3, and now an only move g5, which is already not so easy to realize that black needs to now be quite quick. Otherwise, the king will just run to b3 and then at the right time support the a-pawn. g5, now if king c3, black can take on h4 and will secure a draw like this because the h-pawn secures enough counterplay. So white would need to take on g5, king g5. If rook f7, then rook takes a6. Again, 2 versus 1 is not enough to win here. Black makes a draw. King c3, probably the best try, and now king g4. King b3, heading the rook, rook a1, king b4, now final precise move f5. Preparing king f3 in the next move, since king f3 immediately would fail because of rook takes f7 with check, followed by a7, and white is now up 2 pawns. But after f5, black is ready for king f3 and will have sufficient counterplay to make the draw. So in the game, king e6 was played by Robson, and Bacrot went for rook a8, and then the game went on and on. Later on, it was a draw, but then I guess that Ray blundered in time trouble. Maybe we can have a look at the end of the game afterwards, but what I really want to point out is this variation, now the winning variation, which is king d4. Now it gets a bit sharper. Rook takes f2. This is the only chance for black to start counterplay, just picking up the pawn. And white's winning plan is always to move the rook, so that the rook is not going to be in front of the pawn anymore. But to which square do we go? Do we go to b7 or do we go to c7 here with the rook? If you haven't seen this endgame yet and would like to figure it out by yourself, you can stop the video and try to figure it out by yourself. I will show you guys now what is the right move. White has only one winning move, and it's rook c7. Rook b7 is not enough to win, and we're going to see why that is the case in just a second. Rook c7, the winning move. Black should go rook a2, hitting the pawn on a6, a7. Now king f5. Black needs to activate the king quickly. And another thing why I marked the king red here is kind of if black would have activated the king already a bit earlier, then we would not need to go to this situation. So king activity is the most important thing. So king f5. And now again, white only has one winning move. So if you want to think again, you can stop the video. The most logical move, king c5, is not enough to win here. After king g4, king b6, king takes g3, rook c8, black picks up all of the pawns, and I think that we've already seen this position a bit earlier. Here, black holds a draw, even with 2 tempis to spare, as pointed out by Sam Shankland. I guess that something like king g3, h4, h3 would come, and black would be able to make a draw there. But king c4 is the only winning move in the position, which is probably not something that simple to see in a game if you don't know it. but therefore it's important to either understand it or to remember it. The whole point is now after king g4, we have king b3. And now if the rook goes to any square, then rook c4 is coming with a check, king takes g3, and now rook a4. And now black anyway has to sacrifice the pawn. And now we get a very similar position like earlier, just that our king is on b3, and also it's our move now. In the previous position, it was black to move, because here we had to recapture with the rook in the final position. But here it's white to move, and therefore white is in time to run over with the king. This is a line which I've analyzed, king f1, and h2, rook a3 check. So white is just in time here, king g2 is coming next, picking up the h2 pawn, and white is winning. Also here, nothing else is good enough for black anymore. Black can pick up the rook on c7 like this. Of course, important to point that out, but white will queen. And as long as black doesn't get the king to g7 and the rook on f5 or the rook on e6, if that's the case, then I think black has pretty good chances to set up a fortress. But like this, black is not in time to get that. For example, now queen d8 check, king c4, and black just cannot get back to the g7 square and should lose this endgame. Yeah, if f6 king b5 was quite a cool idea as well, with the point that rook c5 check is now a threat. For example, if rook a1, rook c5, if the king goes to e6, then rook c6 check followed by rook a6 is going to win. And if king g4, then this, and rook a4, and black cannot even sacrifice the rook for the pawn anymore, and white will just get a queen in the next moves. All right, so now you might be asking, why is rook b7 not winning at this position? The whole point now is that if black goes rook a2, a7, king f5, the same which we've seen earlier, king to c4. Now rook a1, as an example, king b5, and now king g4. And now the rook is not on c7, so therefore white does not have this idea with rook c4 check followed by rook to a4. This is the whole point of why white needs to go to c7 with the rook here. Yeah, in the game, I think that Etienne got a couple of chances to reach this position. In the end, he did get it at some point, but the culminating point, let's go here, where black went for rook a3 check. Again, king e5 would have been strong to activate the king. Rook a3 just invites white's king to run there, which now Etienne went for it. Even here, I think that, according to my notes now, king f5 still was enough to secure a draw here. But black went for rook a2, and here already white was winning. We'll just skip a couple of more moves ahead. I think this was another important position. Now, again, there's only one winning move for white. Do we go to a7 with the king, or do we go to a8? Another question for you. Only one winning move. If you want to solve it by yourself, stop the video. I will tell you guys the solution now. It was not played by Etienne in the game. Etienne played king a8. Instead, king a7 is the only winning move, which was another pretty instructive moment, because after king f5, now rook to b8. If the king is on a8, black can go rook a2, hitting the pawn on a6, followed by king g4. But here, the pawn is protected on a6, so therefore white can go rook b4, and then cut off black's king on the 5th rank. 4th rank is not protected, and then go king b7, a7, a8 on the next move, and white is winning. After king a8, that didn't work. Now king f5, maybe Bacrot now realized that after rook b8, rook a2, a7, king to g4. Now the pawn on a6 is attacked. This is kind of the main thing I'm saying. And here black is in time to make a draw with this idea f5, f4, and then take the h4 pawn. Important, and then king g4, h4, h3 will secure a draw. Black is in time with counterplay with the h-pawn. Yeah, now it was a draw, but still the final turning point of the game was, again, quite instructive. Ray Robson was so close to securing the draw here after this type of pawn race, but here he blundered. He went for the push with h2 immediately, which allowed white to win with rook g6 check, king to h3, and now king f2. Now, black cannot take a queen because he's going to lose it with rook h6. So Robson tried to get a knight, but now with the knight in the corner, this is a losing position, because now it's a Zugzwang. If king h3, then rook to h7 is going to be checkmate. So the only way to make a draw here was to go for king g2 first. And now if rook g6 comes, then black has the move king to f1. And then h2 is a threat. If king f3, h2. And now all of these shenanigans don't work with going here with the rook. Anyway, we promote with the check. Also, the king would have the h2 square available, so there are no checkmate ideas now on the first rank. So this would have secured the draw. Still, a very practical example, and I hope this video has given you guys some ideas on this endgame with the extra a pawn. I think again this position is quite important for us to remember, that we should not allow this with black. First of all, here rook a4, king d3, g5 would be the only way to save the game. And with white, for us, it's important to remember that if we get this, we should go for king d4, sacrifice the f2 pawn, and then rook c7, the whole winning idea, and then king to c4 here. So a couple of difficult moves, but once we see that with the idea of, or once we understand that with the idea of king b3, followed by rook c4 check, rook a4, then white can secure victory in this endgame. While editing this, I realized there was one more thing which I left out, which is pretty important for us to remember, I believe, which is with the rook behind the pawn. I also left out rook next to the pawn, but that might be something which we can discuss in a separate video. There are also some pretty nice examples on that. But with the rook behind the pawn, generally this is what we're trying to look with from the attacking side. But there is one rule which was pointed out by Shankland, which is quite easy to remember, which is that if with the a-pawn, if the pawn advances to the 5th rank, then it's going to be winning. If the pawn is still in the 4th rank, it's probably quite promising for white in most cases, but black certainly has drawing chances. With the pawn, however, on the 5th rank, I think it's basically in all cases it should be lost. For example, which is pointed out by Shankland, king f3, king f6, king e4, king e6, king d4, king d6. I mean, now white is already threatening to run to the queen side like this. And now something like rook a2 and black is in Zugzwang. If the king goes to the queen side, then white's king can run in through the king side. And if the king goes to e6, then king c5 will come. And if black's rook waits, then white can just continue pushing the pawn. And all of those pawn endgames are just going to be completely losing, because white always just picks up the pawns like this. Even in the starting position, I gave black a move, and just to see if that makes any difference, and it doesn't. So even if black's king gets to e5, it's still the same story of king d5, king f4, and all of the pawn endgames will be losing if black's king runs there. For example, f6 and then f3, and white will break through with g4, and white is winning. Now, if we look at the position with the pawn on the a4 square, I mean, with pawn on a3 or even pawn on a2 and the rook being in front of the pawn, it's going to be even simpler, or much simpler for black to hold that. But here it's important that black needs to find counterplay with f6 and g5 immediately. Running with the king will not do any good. Yeah, like white will help support the pawn. Maybe still some slight drawing chances for black there, because the rook at least still covers this rank. But black's only way to actually hold the game is to push f6 and g5, which now the significant difference, I mean, it's also sort of concrete, but now with the rook being on a5 still, if you look at this line, black needs to get the king to f5 and then to g4 immediately. King b4, rook has to move. And now black is preparing to take on h4 next, and then king g4. a5, take, king g4. And now if we imagine the same position, I mean, with black's rook being here, basically, then white will anyway always have rook a4 with a check, yeah, or even a move earlier, like here, to already have rook a4 ready with the king being here and black's king not being able to enter. So this is kind of the main difference, that if white's pawn is already on a5, then the rook can always control this 4th rank without any difficulties. But here black is just in time to make a draw, because also the king on b4 is now in a bad position, and black is just in time to pick up the h4 pawn, and black will be in time to make a draw because of counterplay with the h pawn. I thought that was just important to add. I forgot to show you that, guys. I forgot to show you that earlier, guys. And let's get back to the video. So thank you guys for watching. This was the probably final part of the 3 versus 3 plus an extra pawn endgame series. If you guys want to see more of that, let me know in the comment section down below. Hope you enjoyed this video, and again, I'll put a put a link into the description down below for this book. I, again, cannot say it often enough. If you guys want to level up your Rook endgames, definitely get that book. Shout out to Sam Shankland, who really did a great, fantastic work with his book on Rook endgames. So that was it for today. I'm going to see you guys soon. Take care.